what I see happening is a major battle developing around the Donetsk area, around particularly the sort of what in 2022 is called the Slovyansk pocket, that area on the east bank the west bank of the Severodonetsk River. And personally, I might even think about withdrawing as far as Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, or on some of the towns. When I say towns, that's a little bit of an exaggeration. The sort of villages, the larger villages on the outskirts of those two larger towns, cities. And fortifying those urban positions. I mean, one of the things that's really noticeable in this war is defensive positions have been very powerful because of drone surveillance, because of long-range artillery fires. So the defense has been very strong. And when that defense is in the urban, it becomes even stronger. I'm Professor Anthony King. I'm chair of Security Defence Studies at the University of Exeter, and also director of the Strategy and Security Institute. The issue of the concept of a bold defence. Why did I use the word bold? Because the minute one talks about defence, it sounds like it's a retreat, that it's a negative act. But the point at which we're at in the Ukraine war seems to me to have reached a bit of a crux point. If we look at the balance of force on the battlefield, things have moved over the last 6-8 months very significantly in Russian favour. Firstly, in terms of force numbers, the estimates are that Russia have fielded about 400,000 troops into Ukraine, which is much larger than the first year and indeed the first 18 months of the war. Whereas the Ukrainians, the estimates are possibly 300,000. They have a larger militia, but actually force is 300,000, but it may be less. So the Russians have a numeric personnel advantage, and they also have increasing advantages in terms of air power and especially artillery. So the Ukrainians are firing about one shell to every Russian. Well, it depends slightly on the area, but between 7 and 10 shells. So the Ukrainians have ended up in a position where it's very difficult to almost impossible to hold the positions they're at. And at present, their forces are being quite badly decimated and attrited in the positions they're holding around areas like Chasiv Yar and along the front in the Donbass. So at this point, it seems, and this was the purpose of the tweet, it seems important that senior commanders, allies, especially allies wanting to support Ukraine, perhaps embrace a different, bolder but alternative strategy, and a strategy built on a active defence rather than a gradual attrition of the forces at the front. It's extremely easy for me as a civilian to sit back in the UK away from the dangers and invent strategies. And it's an easy thing, and in many ways a despicable thing to do, because one is not bearing any risks or responsibilities here. And it must also be said that when we look to develop a different Ukrainian strategy, there's a sort of more active defensive strategy. What I'm talking about here is a very difficult operation. So it would require Ukrainian forces essentially to keep holding the front line for a while, and then behind them reconstituting a force, building fortified positions, which I would recommend around major urban areas, and then withdrawing the force at the front. Now, that's called a retrograde operation, and they're the most difficult in military operations. So it is difficult, and it's in certain way an impertinence for a civilian to suggest such a thing. But we have reached, it seems to me, that all of the analysis now is pointing to a very significant operational shift on the battlefield. With the opening of a new front at Kharkiv, this puts even more evidence on the case that the battlefield balance of power has shifted. And that seems to me, at this point, incumbent that Ukraine are encouraged to adopt a more radical approach rather than just persisting with the same approach. And there's another point here. Ukrainian forces are currently, frankly, being pushed back. They are on the retreat. The Russians have the initiative. And what also concerns me is that Western aid, which of course the Republican Party was deeply concerned about giving more aid to the Ukrainians, that Western aid will actually be discouraged if all they see is slow, gradual defeat in detail. And so for me, both in terms of what might work on the battlefield and also in encouraging, sustaining, demanding increased Western support, seems to me a more positive strategy needs to be put in place. And ironically for me, the only plausible positive strategy is a defensive one. And this is where I'd say, oh yeah, it can't just be a retreat. It's got to be a withdrawal with a view to actually defeating and inflicting damage on the Russian forces more effectively, while husbanding and preserving Ukrainian forces. So it's a withdrawal, not a retreat, still less a rout. That's the position that I would promote. What my position would be in terms of the lines of withdrawal, where should the Ukrainians withdraw to? This is a slightly complicated issue, and certainly one which a military commander in Ukraine would have the best understanding of what plausible lines of defence would be available, because the line of defence that's best will be also determined by the condition of the Ukrainian forces, which of course is some information which only they would know. But I would certainly, I wouldn't in any way contemplate relinquishing Donetsk, where the key, for me, that is the key theatre, that's the key area at this point. What I see happening is a major battle developing around the Donetsk area, around particularly the sort of what in 2022 is called the Slovyansk pocket, that area on the east bank the west bank of the Severodonetsk River. And personally, I might even think about withdrawing as far as Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, or on some of the towns. When I say towns, that's a little bit of an exaggeration. The sort of villages, the larger villages on the outskirts of those two larger town cities. And fortifying those urban positions. One of the things that's really noticeable in this war is defensive positions have been very powerful because of drone surveillance, because of long-range artillery fires. So the defense has been very strong. And when that defense is in the urban, it becomes even stronger. So if we look at battles like the Battle of Bakhmut, the Battle of Mariupol, or of course the Battle of Kyiv, in each case, the powers of the defender were multiplied by being in urban areas, because they're difficult to get into as an attacker, they're difficult to maneuver into. The buildings offer multiple opportunities for fortification, for concealment, for defence. And so urban areas offer an amplified defensive capability. So for me, that's why I might recommend even thinking about a concentration of Ukrainian forces in Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, even though it would effectively relinquish quite a lot of terrain to the Russians. But here's the thing, that terrain is relinquished so that it effectively becomes what the military call a killing zone, targeting boxes in which artillery fire can be directed. So in order to take those towns deeper into Donetsk, namely Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, the Russians will have to attack a long way. They'll have to attack across large areas, which opens them up to intense attrition by artillery fire. And that is exactly what happened in 2022. So in the battles of Kyiv and the subsequent attacks they made into the Donbass area, this is exactly what happened, that they got terribly attrited as they tried to go round or go into urban areas, with the result that a counterattack was possible. And in a sense, what I would suggest is that maybe by withdrawing into some urban fortress with a view to maximizing the damage that Ukrainian artillery, air power, drones can do, that a counterattack might be possible back end of 2024, early 2025. I mean, I don't think we're talking about a complete counteroffensive in any way. I think that's probably improbable, certainly in this year. But essentially, what I would argue for is it worth thinking about a significant organized withdrawal and concentration of forces to create the conditions for inflicting very serious damage on the advancing Russians? I mean, certainly at the moment, the attempt to just hold a line, which is what the Ukrainians are nobly and very bravely trying to do, with the balance of forces that they've got at their disposal, it doesn't seem to be working brilliantly for them. At the moment, the troops are sort of the front lines are very thinly held, but the distance between the Russian troops and the Ukrainian troops is not very much, and they're effectively fighting across in certain urban areas like Chasiar, but across fields, across these not very densely held fronts, which are redolent of the sort of First World War or the Second World War, but they're not the same in the sense that they're not as densely held. But if you withdraw, let us say you withdraw 10 kilometers or 20 kilometers, and you concentrate your force, so you put an infantry force into a town which lays across through which major roads go, so Russia has to advance along those roads through that town in order to take more territory. The infantry hold that territory, that town, be it Kramatorsk, be it Slovyansk. The Russians have got to advance to drive them out. As they advance to drive them out, they must form up into columns, advanced columns of vehicles, trucks, tanks, armored personnel vehicles, etc., etc. You have to, to be an organized attack, it has to form an attack column. Well, what we know from 2022 and indeed 2023, those attack columns are deeply vulnerable to artillery strike because there's ubiquitous drone coverage, so that the Ukrainians can see whenever there's a concentration of Russian forces, it's very easy to see, and simultaneously, whenever there's a concentration of Ukrainian forces, it's very easy to see. So, but if Ukrainian forces, infantry are in towns, they're difficult to see. But the Russians are easy to see in the open, and the Russians are potentially vulnerable to these artillery and airstrikes as they approach and as they enter towns. And of course, to emphasize and to repeat, if we look back to 2022, this is precisely what repeatedly happened to the Russians. So they approached the initial attack on Kyiv, the airport failed. They tried a ground offensive into the northwest and the northeast of Kyiv, both at appalling cost because their march columns were identified by the Ukrainians and attrited with artillery fire, sometimes with javelin and anti-tank weapons, but most often with artillery fire. Similarly, around Kharkiv in the summer of 2022. Similarly in Mariupol. Similarly at the Battle of Rubizny, similarly at the Battle of Bakhmut. So the idea of a withdrawal to an urbanized fortress creates an open space, a very vulnerable open space across which the Russians, if they want to win, if they want to attack, they've got to cross. And the thing here is that we know from past operations, the Russians are not particularly sophisticated in their military operations, and crossing those areas of dead ground where you are open to artillery fire would require really, really extensive skill, suppressing the artillery, covering and camouflaging your assault. The Russians have repeatedly shown themselves not capable of doing that. So for me, as I say, it's up to Ukrainian commanders what they decide to do. It's their responsibility. I totally defer and respect them. But what I would anticipate is we're approaching a crux point in this war and that just continuing with the techniques and the tactics and the sort of operational design that the Ukrainians have, and which has served them reasonably well, I think, I might suggest that would be suboptimal and maybe unwise. I think, as I say, a bolder strategy might be necessary, though I fully recognize implementing it, enacting it, is going to be difficult, both politically and militarily. Urban areas are incredibly complicated, and it's very easy for defenders to hide in them. And in contemporary military thinking, contemporary military doctrine, essentially, the armies like the US Army or the British Army reckon that in an urban area, if you're on the defence, the combat ratios required to take an urban area is 1-6 or 1-10. So if you've got 50,000 troops attacking Kharkiv and one has 5,000 troops in Kharkiv, you might be able to repel that offensive. And it's such a large city, it's very easy for Ukrainian defenders to hide in it and to fortify certain bits of it, which make it extremely difficult for the Russians to take. A force of 50,000 is quite a large force, but you've got a very large city of 1 million. So it's extremely those 50,000 troops, and when you say 50,000 troops, then you're talking about you actually take the combat troops. The combat troops is a much smaller element. It's probably 20,000. Then they've got to rest. They can't be fighting all the time. So the actual combat element of a 50,000 force becomes actually about 10,000. And the minute you've got 10,000, a city of 1 million is a huge objective for that force to take. And if we look at previous battles, for instance, the Battle of Mosul, which the Iraqi-US coalition fought, the Iraqi army had 94,000 troops against a similar sized city, but there were only 6,000 lightly armed ISIS fighters. In Kharkiv, you've got a population that absolutely does not want the Russians there, and you've got significant forces with artillery, with drones, with air power, determined to hold that objective. So 50,000 troops for a city of a million is actually, a bare minimum, probably less. And the Russians, obviously, in Kyiv were totally incapable of taking Kyiv with a force of 15,000. It was smaller. But this is why, when you get a large urban area, it requires, for a successful clearance operation, it requires prodigious numbers of troops if the defenders really want to hold on to it. And it's so obvious the Ukrainians do. So then the question is, so what's the threat to Kharkiv? Well, the threat to Kharkiv, I think, and my own prediction is this is why the Russians have done it, it draws forces and it draws Ukrainian commanders' attention away from the Donetsk, away from that Slovyansk pocket where operations now are starting to develop, in my view. So that's where I am with the Kharkiv. I mean, of course, I could be proved totally wrong, but I must say I think that if the Russians really want to take Kharkiv, they need a far larger force than they've currently deployed, and so I suspect it's a way of deviating resources, but that's very serious because it exposes the Donbass, I think, very seriously, and that to me gives even more weight to thinking through a new operational design for the Donbass, and an operational design, as I've said, of a operational withdrawal for a bold, more effective, concentrated defence.